Hello, everyone. Good morning. We are here today in this panel to talk about climate change and mental health. And to give you the opening of this session, I will call Dr. Maria, which is our health unit delegate for the International Federation of the Red Cross in the Americas. Welcome, Dr. Maria, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Esther, and thank you so much for all participants to this forum. And I want also to thank the people that have organized this session. I'm in Italy, actually, so it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon here. But I'm very pleased to be with you and to hear about your comment on this thematic area. Well, the forum for us is to analyze, to discuss, to propose action on mental health due to the impact of climate change. We know that climate change is provoking more disaster than before, and these disasters are devastating life, are devastating also asset of people, are creating more inequality, more instability, sometimes are responsible for huge displacement of people. Because especially in the Caribbean island, in the Caribbean region, climate change have provoked huge losses in the economy of the people, but also in the community in general. No? So our interest is to look at the effect on the welfare of people. And we know then beyond everything is on losing asset for the people, the quality of health in general, no? The quality of air, the quality in terms of nutrition, the quality on people work. The climate change has also generating stress, fear, and mental health problems. Unfortunately, all the study, all the literature that we have reviewed are still incipient, and we have no numbers. We know in general the climate change is provoking 150,000 deaths every year. And WHO has estimated that this number will grow to 150,000 deaths more every year, because the intensity of climate change disaster. But we know that there are new vulnerabilities that will come up as soon as we are interested on this thematic area. We have more skill, we have more knowledge, and we discover new issue about the impact on health of climate change. So what we want to do in this forum is, first of all, to agree on the effect that we know right now, and also to start some investigation on the effect on our community, in our family, and ourselves as first responder. Let me say then, every time there is a disaster, people who are in the first line, they have they express the need for first aid, psychological first aid help. And this is because they are stressed by the situation, are living in supporting the community to cope with the impact of the emergency. So this is a huge concern for us, how we can help, because the recovery is faster if we have people that are able to reduce the stress, the fear, and of course the impact of other people suffer. Okay, so our concern is then we have not so many numbers, evidence to convince government, our national society to act urgently on this area. And this is what we want to promote today, how we can create new evidence, then help us to work better on this area. So I hope so then with the intelligence of all of you, the experience of all of you, and the willingness to work on this, we can organize a couple of action, then help us to do more and better for the next couple of years. So thank you so much for helping us on this, and we will be with you on this effort. Thank you, Esther, Don, Peter, Akin, Jason, Wayne, no, is your name, you are called Wayne, and Jura. And thank you, Maria, for helping us in this session. The floor is with you, Esther. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Maria, for your words. And absolutely, we are all resonating these words, I believe. And we will be hearing more and more echoes of what Dr. Maria said in the speech of all the panelists, I believe. I will present briefly the panelists that we have today. So today we are here with two representatives of our national societies for the Red Cross, which is Dr. Jason Winter, which is also a psychologist, and is a representative for the Jamaica Red Cross. Welcome, Dr. Jason. We also have here today Jerwayne Laidlaw. He is our representative in the St. Vincent and Grenadines in our National Society for the Red Cross. Thank you for being here, Jerwayne. We also have today Don Bean, which is our health delegate in the cluster in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you for being here, Don, always with us. We have today Dr. Jura Augustinavicius, and I'm very sorry if I mispronounced your name. But we are calling her today Dr. Jura just for being easier. She is an assistant professor in the University of McGill in Canada, and she is also working in research in climate change and mental health. So she will give us the insights on research in this area. Thank you for being here today, Dr. Jura. Dr. Peter Weller is with us today. He is a representative of CAMPA, which is the Alliance of Psychological Associations in the Caribbean region. Among other things that Dr. Peter do, he's also a community clinical psychologist, and he is working in the field for long years in many events. So he will give us a very a share of the experience that he has in the region. Thank you for being here, Dr. Peter. And we also have, for the last but not least, Akil Calendar with us. Thank you for being here. He's a young representative in this panel, a youth representative who is an activist for climate change. And he will tell us a little bit more of how the youth is contributing and how can they contribute. Thank you for being here. He is talking all the way from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean region as well. Thank you for being here. And we are going to start with Dr. Jura. Dr. Jura, what can you tell us about the impacts of mental health, of climate change in mental health?
Thanks so much for the introduction, Esther, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with everyone and to meet all of you today. So I thought I would start just by describing a little bit of what drives mental health sort of risk in the context of the climate crisis. And some of you may be familiar with the Lancet. It's a large journal that publishes on medical research, public health research. And in 2019, the Lancet Countdown report on climate change emphasized that a child born that year would witness impacts on their health from birth through older adulthood. So, we'll hear a lot more from Akil later on, and I think those insights are critical. But I just want to emphasize that this is a generational issue and a life course issue that's affecting those who are born today and those who are young today in particular. And a decade earlier, the same Lancet Commission had already concluded that climate change was the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. So I don't need to convince all of you. You're here today because you recognize this is an important issue, but it is increasingly being recognized as perhaps the most important issue of our time. And climate change is also driving specific humanitarian needs. So, for example, the 2020 Global Humanitarian Overview by OCHA listed climate change as both an emerging trend and risk. And OCHA actually estimates that 1 in 33 people worldwide will need humanitarian assistance and protection this year in 2021. And that already represents a large increase from 1 in 45 in 2020, when humanitarian needs were already the highest that they had been in decades. So these times are unprecedented. Some of the things that are driving humanitarian needs include water scarcity, which is rapidly increasing with climate change and has been linked to the risk of violent conflicts. There's, of course, a large body of literature that's demonstrating that extreme weather-related events are increasing in severity and intensity and frequency with climate change. And we know that during extreme weather events, there are increased rates of violence, different forms of violence like intimate partner violence, child and elder abuse, family violence, and other forms of gender-based and community violence. There are also reports suggesting that rates of child marriage are increasing as child marriage is being used to cope with the social, financial, and infrastructure stresses that climate change is posing. And so, the other thing that is happening with the climate crisis and related to humanitarian needs is an increase in migration. So the International Organization for Migration reported that more people are now being displaced due to disasters caused by natural hazards or extreme weather events than conflicts or violence, and that was in 2020. And we know that when people are on the move, particularly in situations of forced migration, they face numerous stressors during this displacement process and in their post-migration environment, so after they resettle in a new location. And this is, of course, related to a lack of resources, family separation, social isolation and discrimination, socioeconomic factors, and harmful immigration and refugee policies. So these are all already issues that migrants face that are being even further potentially exacerbated within the climate crisis. And the other thing that's quite important to think about when considering climate change and migration is that, I think typically with migration, we think about people being forced to move, but we don't often consider those who stay behind, either because they choose to stay behind or because they are forced to stay behind. And so it's really important to think about people who either can't leave or choose not to leave, and also those who might migrate by force or not into sites that are experiencing even worse climate change impacts than the one that they came from, or similar, right? So just because people leave a place because of the climate crisis doesn't mean that they're actually going somewhere that's safer or better for them. The conditions may in fact be worse. So anyways, all of these complexities related to migration are important to consider. So how does this all relate to mental health, and what do we know from the literature on mental health? And I think Dr. Maria said very eloquently earlier when she sort of introduced the panel, rightly so, that the research in this area is growing rapidly, but there's still a lot more to be done. And so we've really seen this exponential rise in literature in the last 20 years on mental health and well-being in the context of the climate crisis. But I think one of the most important things that stands out from this literature, where we need to do a lot more work, is that the literature is largely coming from global north centers. So there's very little literature and research that's being done in the global south on this topic, and that's being done by scholars in the global south. And this is a major gap and a serious inequity, because what it really represents is a disconnect between places that are experiencing the worst impacts from climate change and our understanding of what is actually happening there from local perspectives, which are, of course, the most important than some of these global things. So I just want to emphasize that before I launch into kind of describing what the existing literature with its limitations does say about climate crisis and mental health research. And I think that the attendees today will really enjoy hearing from others on the panel who have much more sort of expertise in what's happening on the ground than I do. So in a global sort of sense and from a global perspective, I'm going to describe a few links with mental health from the perspective of various climate crisis exposures. So that means types of things that are impacted by the climate crisis that then impact mental health. And one of those things is what we call acute climate change related exposure. So here, we're really talking about extreme weather related events such as tropical cyclones, floods, wildfires, extreme heat, these types of things. And I would say that most of the climate crisis and mental health literature has actually focused on these types of exposures and their impacts on mental health. So there's this whole kind of disaster mental health area that we actually know a fair bit about. There's been a lot of work done to kind of understand mental health and well-being in the context of disasters, and to develop guidance and programming around what should be done in disaster settings. And so we know that these kinds of extreme weather events are, like I said, increasing in frequency and intensity with climate change. And they've been linked to both mental health morbidity and mortality. So we heard earlier about, for example, from Dr. Maria about the number of deaths projected under climate change. But when we think about mental health and some other chronic health outcomes, what we're really talking about, unless we're talking about suicide, is about morbidity. So how is this impacting the way people live day to day? How is this impacting the way people think and feel as they're going about their lives and how they behave? So we know that acute climate change exposures, like, again, tropical cyclones, floods, wildfires, extreme heat, are associated with higher levels, so increased mental health symptoms, increased rates of mental disorders, higher levels of suicide, so there is a mortality element as well, and sort of bigger strain on the healthcare system. So for example, we know that during periods of extreme heat, there are higher levels of mental health related hospital admissions, and in settings where there are emergency departments, we know that more people present to those departments with severe mental health problems. Having said all of this, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, I just want to emphasize that what we're talking about right now are sort of moderate to severe reactions to climate change related exposures. But in general, it's really important to recognize that a lot of these reactions are potentially normal, and we don't want to pathologize any reaction to adversity in general. That's a very important kind of thing to bear in mind. But it is important to recognize that there is an increased burden of mental health in the context of climate change. And earlier, hearing Dr. Maria kind of talk about the lack of numbers, I think she's absolutely right. And what we have in the literature right now from what we know about disasters includes an extremely wide range of prevalence estimates for specific disorders that may not even be the most important things to study in these contexts. But I will just kind of give you some numbers. So for example, in terms of prevalence after extreme weather events, we see a range of PTSD prevalence, so the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder, between 0 and 75%. So that's a massive range. And we also know that there's a massive range in rates of depression prevalence. So 1.9 to about 60%, also a massive range. What predicts worse outcomes? Well, we know that there are differences by gender, by socioeconomic status. So of course, people living with fewer resources are more likely to experience worse outcomes, higher levels of exposure to the disaster or extreme weather event, and having fewer psychosocial resources to actually cope with what's going on is related to poor outcomes. And so what do we do with these numbers? I mean, the range is so wide. How do we really understand this? And so I think that's part of the problem. This may reflect, it likely does reflect the true degree to which populations are experiencing these issues, but there's also a lot of measurement error. And we need to be really careful about how we select which mental health and well-being outcomes to study to ensure that they're the outcomes that are most relevant to populations living in settings heavily impacted by the climate crisis in the first place. And we also really need to make sure that we measure those things well in a way that's locally relevant and understood. So that's what I'll say about prevalence. So we've talked about these kind of acute climate change related exposures. I'd like to move on to another type of climate change related exposure, which we call chronic climate change related exposures. Some of you may have also heard of slow creeping climate change related exposures. So a smaller body of the climate change and mental health literature has also shown that these chronic or slower creeping climate change related exposures are associated with disruptions to landscapes and places, and thus adverse mental health impacts and outcomes. And so what these things do is that they affect a sense of place and identity, and they can lead to emotional responses of anxiety, grief, anger, helplessness, depression, among many others. And there is literature describing this. Within this area, there's also an emerging literature on the science of loss, with reports of ecological grief, which I'll describe in a second, and disruptions to connections to land, culture, relationships, and community ties. And we know how important these things are for sustaining our well-being on a day-to-day basis. So I'm just going to highlight three kind of emerging, I would say, or emergent concepts within climate change and mental health, just so that you're familiar with these terms. I just mentioned ecological grief. And so scholars who have sort of developed this concept and study it, including Ashley Consolo and Ellis, define ecological grief as the grief that's felt in relation to experienced or anticipated ecological losses, including the loss of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes due to acute or chronic environmental change. And so there I was quoting a paper that they published in 2018. So that's ecological grief. Another concept that you may have heard about is solastalgia, which is a kind of homesickness while at home. And it refers to, and again, I'm gonna quote Glenn Albrecht, who wrote about this in 2007. It refers to pain or distress caused by the loss of or inability to derive solace connected to the negatively perceived state of one's home environment. And so I think that's quite a powerful idea. This feeling of homesickness when you haven't actually left your home, you're still in the same place, but it's changing around you. And so the third kind of category, I would say, of climate, third and last, so you can be relieved, category of climate change related exposures that I'd like to cover are anticipated and vicarious exposures. So there's a lot of interest, I would say, in the climate change and mental health academic space right now, in the idea that simply knowing about or anticipating the problem of climate change might induce some sort of adverse mental health reaction. So in psychological terms, vicarious experience refers to exposure through someone else's experience. For example, vicarious trauma can occur among first responders, medical service providers, or friends and family of someone who has directly experienced a traumatic event. And there's a small, although limited, body of empirical evidence on this at the moment in the context of the climate crisis, but it is an area of great interest in the field. There's very little epidemiological information on mental health problems in the context of those chronic or anticipated and vicarious climate change related exposures. And so the sort of famous or infamous example, depending on your perspective, of anticipated or reactions to sort of anticipated exposures is, of course, climate change anxiety. And many of you have probably heard of this term. And so pretty much anyone who knows about climate change globally could experience climate change anxiety. And this makes it an important psychological construct to study, but we still know relatively very little about it. And I think that Susan Clayton, who wrote a lot about climate anxiety and published a paper in 2021 on this, did a nice job of kind of summarizing what it is about climate change that makes it a kind of an interesting stressor in relation to anxiety. And so she emphasizes that, number one, climate change is a real threat, so it's rational to experience some worry about it. We also know that it's ongoing and developing. So simple adaptation to climate change isn't possible. It's constantly evolving. There are constantly new issues. It's also uncertain. So anxiety may be a more common response than fear because of that sort of unpredictability. And although its impacts are completely unequally distributed globally, it is something that's globally shared. It's happening to all of us, and there's no escaping it. So the responses of others could serve as an indicator to us of its severity and sort of its potential, and therefore that it is a major significant threat. And so the big kind of question when it comes to climate change anxiety is it maladaptive or is it actually adaptive? And I don't think we actually know enough to say, and there probably isn't a sort of a binary answer to that, a yes or no answer to that. So in general, I'll just say that anxiety becomes maladaptive when the sensitivity to potential problems is too great. So the difference between what we expect to happen and what actually happened is too much. And that triggers an emotional response and rumination that actually prevent us from resolving the anxiety. And then it starts to impact our functioning. And so that's something at an individual level, I think, just to consider. On the other hand, climate change anxiety is probably extremely normative. This is a major threat that humanity is facing at the moment, and the anxiety is telling us that exactly. So I'm just going to close with one kind of final comment. And just to recap, I've sort of given you a whirlwind tour of 3 types of climate change related exposures that impact mental health. So we've talked about acute climate change related exposures, chronic or slow creeping climate change related exposures, and then these anticipated and vicarious exposures, which we really know sort of the least about, but where there's a lot of interest. The other thing that's really important to understand about climate change and mental health is that most of the associations between the crisis and mental health are not direct, and they actually operate through or become exacerbated by things in between. So things like physical health problems, and importantly, the social and environmental situations in which we live our lives and in which we participate in our communities. And so sometimes we refer to these social and environmental situations as the social and environmental determinants of mental health. And these include social, political, and economic factors that influence our mental health at the population level. So they include things like societal structures that determine or reinforce inequalities, like economic inequality, exposure to adverse life events. And so we know that, for example, acute climate change related exposures can result in humanitarian emergencies or complex emergencies when they happen in settings where there are already issues or where climate change is compounding issues. And of course, the basic conditions that really define vulnerability and resilience. So just to provide you a quick example of what this might look like, We know that, for example, air pollution from burning fossil fuels has been linked to symptoms of anxiety and depression among children. And of course, people living in communities with fewer resources are often exposed to more air pollution than those who are living in higher resource communities. And so, with all of this said, I think the most important thing is to understand the perspectives of our colleagues who are living in settings and working in settings most impacted by the climate crisis. Maybe you can even ignore everything I've just said now, because those local experiences will vary tremendously within that. And this is kind of a very large global perspective driven by literature that's really been developed in the global north, but hopefully that will change very soon. And I just encourage us to really think about these kind of social and environmental determinants when we're and life course impacts when we're designing programs, and thinking about really meeting needs holistically. So not delivering services in silos, and considering how to integrate services to meet basic needs as well as mental health and well-being needs, and to support people in adapting to and mitigating climate change in the first place. I'll stop there, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Judah. Thank you. Brilliant. You did a brilliant job. We are not taking anything that you said and throwing away. We are just incorporating and giving the perspective of the locals, as you said, which will be very rich for us. And on that note, I want to hear from Dr. Peter how he can tell us or share with us the experiences that he has seen on the ground since he is living in the islands of the Caribbean. And you can talk to us a little bit more about that as well, because I know that you have traveled quite a lot in the islands as well. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours, Dr. Peter.
Thank you, Esther. Is everyone hearing me clearly? Okay, great. Well, Dr. Jura, that was an excellent presentation, really comprehensive, and so much more that we could learn from each of the elements of, of your sharing. So I hope we can hear more later. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm actually in this space partly representing the Caribbean Alliance of National Psychological Associations, but I'm also a Red Cross volunteer and co-chair in CANPA of the Disaster Mental Health Committee. So there are a number of perspectives that I want to share. First, let me talk from the CANPA perspective. Now, CANPA is an alliance of national psychological associations. Its overarching goal, of course, is to facilitate coordination and collaboration among psychologists across the region to ensure that in the delivery of our services, in our research, and all the work we do, we're contributing to regional development. It was identified and has been identified over a period of time that if we don't work together, we're not going to have the cumulative impact we want to have. And that is why the last few comments by Dr. Jura really, resonated with what we are about. It's about facilitating coordination, collaboration, strategic planning, a holistic approach to responding to problems and responding and facilitating development. As psychologists, of course, our special area is the study of human behavior, and from my perspective, changing and influencing human behavior. So climate change really is something that we are dealing with at every level of the work that we do. Were we to have more time, I would talk more about the ISC model and the IFRC framework for looking at services in disasters and crises, etc. Maybe I'll touch on that again later. But I think that the critical thing here is that if we're going to understand how to respond to climate change, whether it is acute, creeping, chronic, or as was said, virtual and anticipatory, we have to understand where people's heads are at. We have to understand the mindsets that exist. And this is why it's so critical to appreciate and factor into any equations, any formulae that we have for intervention, factor in culture. And I think, again, this is where CANPA is very important. CANPA represents all the alliances. So it is English speaking, French, Spanish, Dutch, it's continental, it's island in terms of the Caribbean. And so we try to bring together a multicultural approach to inform a multisectoral and intersectional approach to responding to issues in the Caribbean. Having said that, I think that there are a few points I'd like to make with regard to CANPA and the work we're doing. And there are issues that are going to be addressed in our upcoming conference, which is taking place on November 10th. Um, and it's online, so it's a virtual conference, and you'll be able to get the link to that later. What I wanted to say is that we have found that as we have done this work in the region, we often hear the term community of interest and we hear the term community of care, but we don't really fully understand what it takes to build that community, what it takes to create something that is stronger than just an interest and overarching a practice to achieve the actual care, the actual intervention that is needed. And what we've realized is that many of us in the region, not only psychologists, but many of us who are working in mental health, public health, and of course now disaster and climate health, mental health issues, many of us don't quite share a frame of reference that allows us to have a common perspective, even though we might bring our unique skills and competences, to ensure that there's a united approach to addressing these problems. So one of the things that we want to try to promote and advocate for, and I'm hoping that this will resonate with those who are participating today, is ensuring that we all understand some of the common frames of reference that help us to understand crises, climate change, and their effect on mental health. As we've done work in the region, we've found that I think the best way to put it would be to say that there is not enough appreciation of, I'm trying to get it, the models that exist. Okay, so as psychologists, we kind of have our theoretical frames or cognitive or we're analytic or whatever. But when we come to this field, that's not what really applies when it comes to helping people understand what is going on with climate, with disasters, and understanding their own responses, and then integrating it into an intervention that can work at the individual, the group, at all the socio-ecological levels. We need to have models that help us find ways to frame all of these theoretical orientations, to find the commonalities, and then act on them. We can bring our unique competencies, as I said before, but we need to find ways to do that. We need to help develop an appreciation of the services that are likely to be needed so that we can prepare for them. If we understand the needs, then we can better prepare to develop the services that are needed. And again, when I mentioned the ISC model and the IFRC framework, it's about talking about, at the basic level, what is it that everybody needs to function. Then as the trauma or the dislocation or the dysfunction increases, what are the services that are needed and what are the competencies and functions of the providers as we move up to the higher level of dysfunction, which might be more severe mental illness and disorders. So if we understand what the needs are, and if we understand what services are going to be needed, and if we look at what services are available, we can together design and develop something that is developmental, that is allowing us to work towards meeting needs that we're not still sure what they're going to be like. As Dr. Jura said, we don't know where climate change is going to evolve, but we also know that there are many other challenges that we face in society. What we do have to do is to find ways to work together. And this is one of the reasons why this forum is so important as another step towards facilitating a common understanding and a collaborative and coordinated approach to this kind of work. We also have to be sure that we have in place the spaces to do this kind of collaboration. And so again, the virtual spaces like this are very important. But we need to also understand that in the Caribbean, and I won't speak for any other region, we are people. We're accustomed to connecting and linking and having relationships. And unfortunately, in the virtual space, that is not something that is easily facilitated. And therefore, even though we may have these fora, they don't necessarily facilitate the kinds of bonds and connections that are sustainable. There's no easy answer to that. It just means that we have to keep evolving and developing ways to do this. Um, as psychologists and folks working in mental health, there's also a very important issue that Dr. Jura mentioned, which is understanding that disaster mental health is a special area that overlaps with many other areas. Um, and so the cognitive and emotional challenges um, are acute, they're chronic, they're creeping, they are evolving, and they differ for, by gender, by age, by stage, by socioeconomic level, etc. And this is something that we need to understand. It was mentioned earlier that there are a number of competencies that have been developed and models, such as psychological first aid, etc. Yet we have found that, for example, psychological first aid, which is designed to be something provided not necessarily by a professional, can be a challenge to a professional. So somebody who's trained as a clinician or a counselor may not understand how to make that shift to doing psychological first aid. And we have to help develop that competence, because in the moment, in the crisis, whether you're under a volcano in St. Vincent and the Grenadines or being buffeted around by Dorian in the Bahamas, people don't need psychotherapy. They don't need in-depth counseling. They don't need anybody asking them about their childhood or asking them about other things that are not relevant. They need to have psychological first aid, and our professionals need to be prepared to provide it. And therefore, going back to the role of CANPA, I think it is really important for us as psychologists and professionals to understand how to facilitate this service, bringing the competencies we have in terms of therapy and counseling, but also the competencies we have in terms of organizational psychology, social psychology, developmental psychology. All the aspects of psychology need to be brought to bear as we respond. It's not just about counseling and therapy. And in the moment of the crisis, it may not be about that at all. It may be about that psychological first aid. But here I segue also into the important role that psychologists can play in providing other services. And I'm saying this not to psychologists, but to everybody who needs to know what to ask psychologists to do. And we psychologists need to be prepared to provide services when it comes to message design and development and delivery, because a lot of the communications that are done in the region, supposedly to help people deal with disasters, deal with climate change, etc., is not psychologically informed. It may be informed by communication theory, but that is a whole different science and art. And I think that psychologists need to be more involved in the promotion, prevention campaigns, and in the self-care campaigns, because that's something we understand. We don't have the final answer, but we have a significant role to play when it comes to developing these programs. And we need to therefore develop the spaces for this to happen. At the national level, therefore, we need more partnership and collaboration between the entities that are working on the ground. You can have Red Cross societies, you will have psychological associations, psychiatric associations, social work associations, faith-based organizations, etc. And then you have all the NGOs and the CBOs. They're all out there doing good work. But when do they get together? Well, they get together in the crisis. And what happens in the crisis? Everybody's doing their own thing. If they don't have a model and a framework, and this is one of the things that CANPA is actively trying to promote, using the existing frameworks, etc. What can we talk about now in advance, as we are doing here, that will set the stage, for example, for the next hurricane season, for the next eruption, for the next climate change event, whatever it might be? We don't want to wait till it happens to try to start setting up systems. Now, in the Caribbean, we do have systems already in place. We have organizations like SIDEMA, as well as the international networks, etc. But finding a space where everybody gets together beforehand to create protocols, to create relationships, to create communication channels is a gap that we feel needs more work. Some work is being done, but more work needs to be done. Because as climate change continues to affect us, and Dr. Jura gave us all the frame of reference we need, highlighting key points, but we know it's much deeper than that. We know that grief is a significant issue, that loss is something that is unexamined. We know that faith and religious beliefs play a significant role in people's coping mechanism, and I say and carefully, along with that, can cause problems. Beliefs can help and beliefs can hinder. You know, in times of crisis like this, in times of change, when people are feeling so uncertain, so helpless, um, they look for answers. They buy into conspiracy theories. If there's nobody there to challenge those theories with facts in a comprehensive and cohesive way that's coming from multiple messengers, those conspiracy theories will get legs and run. They seek leadership. And if the leaders are being challenged by these alternate messages, they're going to find a leader who fits with what they believed before. And unfortunately, that lends itself to aligning with leaders, let me say, with questionable agendas. And we're seeing it, unfortunately and very tragically, in certain religious spaces recently, and we're seeing it in political spaces. Our people need to get the facts and information, and they need to be taught critical thinking, and they need to be provided with spaces to debate and discuss what is going on, rather than to hold on to what keeps them feeling safe and secure, which may be an anchor that pulls them down rather than helps them to proceed. The point I'm making is there is an important role to play in coordinating and collaborating the work we do. There are many issues I'd want to mention. Speaking about how it is, well, Akil will probably talk about this, but I still need to touch on it. I don't think many adults understand what it must be like to grow up in this world over the last 10 years when all you hear disaster, environment, ice melting, heat waves, bombs, disease, HIV. Oh, I mean, that's all they hear. What does this do to the mind of young people? And then social media is exposing them to all the interpretations and versions and all the ways to cope, not necessarily in the healthy way. I'm not going to take over your presentation, Akil, but I'm saying that again, this is a whole body of knowledge that needs to be integrated. It's not for child psychologists, it's not for UNICEF, it's not for organizations only working, it's for all of us to understand, because those children have teachers, they have parents, they have older siblings, they have many others who need to be involved in helping them to manage. Elders, I'm in that range now, actually. And I can tell you, and it gets very foggy in my mind sometimes when all the things are coming at me and I'm trying to juggle and process. I can't process the way I used to. And for many who are getting older, it is much harder to cope with all of this information, especially if you are not in a situation where you have support to do it. And so we have our elders who are now housebound, who are detached from their church groups, who are not able to go to the store where Mr. Brown knows them or Miss Smith knows them. And it's horrible. And unfortunately, those who normally would reach out and care are not able to because they are limited by curfews, etc., etc. So these are all areas. We talked about the children, we talked about the elders, the adolescents. You're supposed to be liming, you're supposed to be having fun. How you do that virtually. Well, you can try, but it's not quite the same thing. And as a result, there's a frustration. And as I say frustration, of course, I will have to address the issue of gender based violence. Because the power inequities and the pre existing conditions we talk about so often when we talk about COVID, but they're relevant in all aspects of life. The pre existing conditions in society that lead to gender inequity and in relationships that have led to problems in the relationships are now being exacerbated. They're being exacerbated in the lockdown to COVID, but they're being exacerbated when people look out and think, well, what's going to happen? Everything is so uncertain. And that frustration builds up and people act out. Primarily men being abusive to women, but abuse takes place between genders and between age groups, etc. And it is something that we need to be aware of. Again, if we're going to address these problems that exist not only in result of climate change, but are pre-existing conditions, it can only be successfully done if we do it together. If we find ways to share the information that we each, as individuals, as organizations, have gleaned from the years of experience, but also from our current and contemporary interventions. And so let me just mention this one pet peeve of mine. Information and data and research and statistics are of very little use to facilitate change if they had to go through a process where you had to get funding, collect the data, analyze the data, keep it to yourself while you prepared to submit for review, and then it ends up in a folder or a file in a system. And then somebody retrieves it and tries to tell you to design a program today that's based on what adolescents were thinking 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Not an efficient and effective way. We have to find a way to ensure that the data and the research that is done, the information that is robust, is used in a timely fashion so that it really has impact. It really doesn't help telling me what people thought 5 and 4 and 3 years ago when there was no lockdown and there was no COVID. Things have changed. So again, it gets back to sharing information. It gets back to creating these communities of care that include communities of interest, that include communities of practice, being those who are on the ground in the field doing it. And together, hopefully, being prepared to manage this chronic creeping problem of climate change. It's all about changing people's behavior, and it's all about managing their minds. But we have to manage our minds first. And so those of us who are in this kind of position and role have to also take care of ourselves. And as we've learned from disasters in the region over the last few years, a very important area of focus and group that we have to work with. We keep talking about the healthcare workers and the frontline workers, but we forget about those at the desk, at the phone, online, trying to manage and coordinate the frontline while meeting the political directorate and the funding agencies' objectives. And I like to just make a little call for support for those caught in between, that kind of sandwich group who is not frontline and is not at the head table, but is struggling very hard to keep programs going, to keep things going, and sometimes gets lost when we think about mental health and wellness and managing changes. We all need help. We're all in this together, and hopefully we can move forward together in more effective and efficient ways with more of these fora and more of this sharing. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Peter. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And a lot that you have said, it's something very important. And I believe what you said summarized very well what we so much called community-based approach, because we have to involve everyone. And this is a core value of our movement as well. And on that note, I want to call Akil to give us the perspective of the youth in the region and what you are doing. As Dr. Peter said, time changed. We, the old generation, have our old ways, but we have seen great leaders coming up from your generation, and this really gives me a lot of hope. So please share with us so others can also be filled with this hope for young people like you who are doing great job.
Thank you, Esther. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking amongst these other panelists. So thank you for having me. Um, so, as was previously said, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm a youth climate activist. I'm active within the Commonwealth Youth Climate Network and the Climate Reality Leadership Corps. And I have also founded an environmental movement based in Trinidad and Tobago aimed at bridging the gap between climate change science and public understanding. So basically raising awareness. And I've been fortunate to be able to participate on in an international context as well. I recently attended the United Nations Youth for Climate event that brought around 400 young people from around the world to Italy to debate around climate change and create a document that would represent the youth demands to global leaders for the climate. And I'll speak a bit more about this later, but I wanna talk today from the standpoint of a budding expert and also from a youth and climate activist standpoint. And I'd like to cover a few topics. I'd like to briefly talk about why climate change related mental health disorders and climate anxiety are now so predominant amongst the youth populations. I'd like to talk about how the youth see climate change and the core reasons why the climate crisis presents such a daunting issue for us around the world. And then finally, I'd like to wrap up talking about what support can be provided by policy and decision makers, by the healthcare systems, by organizations that are focused on mental health and healthcare, and by the elders, so teachers, community leaders, caregivers around the world with regards to this issue. So I'm going to start off by briefly painting a picture for our audience regarding what's happening around our world with regards to climate change. And I will illustrate some of the effects that Dr. Maria mentioned in the introduction, because I always believe that it's good for people to know that this is an ongoing issue. It's happening now. And so all of the examples that I bring to the table now will have all occurred within the last 2 months. So to start off, on October the 4th, Oman, which is a small country in the Middle East, received 3 years worth of rainfall in 24 hours. On the same day, the Genoa province in Italy received 30 inches of rain in just 12 hours. Now, to give a comparison, Trinidad and Tobago receives roughly 67 inches of rain every year. So that's just under half of what we receive, and that happened in 12 hours. That's about 40% of what Jamaica receives in a given year. So you can imagine there was widespread destruction, loss of life, and of course the mental health issues that would result from events like these. In Asia, heavy rains, the heaviest rains in 100 years, in fact, hit parts of India and Nepal just last week, killing over 150 people in unusual late season weather events. California, which has this year been experiencing its worst drought and the worst fire season in recorded history, has been also hit by a powerful storm this week, which knocked out power to hundreds of thousands and turned the ashes that were left behind by the fires into life-threatening mud flows. And then finally in August, we had Hurricanes Ida and Grace impacting the islands of the Caribbean, parts of Central America, and the USA. And these were jointly responsible for 129 deaths and 65.7 billion US dollars in damages. So these disasters are occurring now. And in almost every circumstance, there's something that the media doesn't really cover or bring to your attention. And that's the involvement of youth. Youth are affected by these disasters. And for the young people who experience these disasters or who are at constant risk of experiencing these disasters, um, climate-related mental health disorders are the most impacting. These young people are at risk of losing their homes, or they lose their homes, their support systems, their cultures and traditions, and they experience the effects of post-traumatic distress. There are also many young people who may not necessarily be at risk of experiencing these direct mental health challenges, but they do experience mental health challenges that are unrelated to a particular climate event. And this climate, or eco-anxiety as it's called, is usually related to just knowledge of the global climate crisis and the threat of present and future environmental disaster. So yes, everyone experiences these things in these situations. There are also adults and elders who are affected. But as the previous speakers have mentioned, it is worse for the youth because it's a problem that we should be dealing with or might be dealing with our entire lives if no action is taken. Children born post 2010 will grow up in a world riddled by disaster, food and water insecurity, mass migration, conflicts, and loss of biodiversity, loss of the natural world. And young people are becoming increasingly aware of this, aware of the dangers of climate change. We are talking to our peers, we're getting together, and we're coming out in mass to demand action. But that awareness is also driving mental health issues in children and youth. A recent study published in The Lancet in 2021, researchers asked around 10,000 young persons from 10 different countries about climate change, and nearly 60% of the respondents felt very worried or extremely worried about climate change, with 45% saying that their feelings impacted their daily lives. And then over half of these respondents also associated climate change with feelings of sadness, fear, anxiety, anger, and powerlessness. So we can see that there's definitely a tangible effect on the mental health of youth and children with regards to the climate crisis. Now, it's not all negative. These feelings have led to an explosion of youth-led climate action occurring around the world in the past 3 years. For example, in March 2019, over 1.6 million school-aged children from 125 different countries participated in school strikes and demanded that urgent and decisive action be taken to combat climate change in their respective countries. And that is positive, but you then have the ongoing visible effects of a worsening climate happening, coupled with continued inaction from world leaders and large-scale polluters. That is quite visible. And this further contributes to those feelings of helplessness and frustration by young persons who feel like their voices are not heard, who are not yet old enough to have seats at decision-making tables, and in fact, many are not yet old enough to vote. So, for example, just to illustrate this point, just this week, high-polluting countries such as Saudi Arabia, Japan, and Australia were found to be lobbying the United Nations and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scientists to downplay the need to move away from fossil fuels ahead of the 26th Conference of Parties Climate Summit happening starting on Sunday. So the inaction is clear, it's visible, and the youth are noticing. And in fact, the study that I previously mentioned from The Lancet showed that 65% of youth stated that when it comes to combating climate change, governments are failing young persons, and 64% agree that governments are lying about the impacts about climate actions that are being taken. And 60% felt that their distress was being dismissed. So what we essentially have is a sort of positive feedback loop of climate anxiety in youth and climate change mental health disorders. You have awareness that is breeding anxiety. The anxiety is causing action, but then the action without results is enforcing that anxiety. So this is leading to new psychological conditions and worsening existing mental health conditions and illnesses among young people who are experiencing climate anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and other disorders. So how do we fix this? I think, based on my experience, a two-pronged approach is quite valuable. And as Dr. Jura and Dr. Maria stated previously, there's a lack of research surrounding climate anxiety and climate-related mental health disorders in general, but particularly so for youth. It has yet to be seen as a legitimate cause of concern in many circles because of this paucity of research and this lack of data. And in fact, most climate anxiety resources that you might find online, which is where youth would go to first if they're experiencing a problem, they tend to be self-directed guides to coping and often suggest taking action, which, as we've seen, can lead to the enforcing of climate-related mental health disorders. So we need these climate-related mental health disorders to be treated with a similar level of attention as other mental health disorders, and treatment options need to be widely and readily available for those experiencing these issues, in particular the youth. So we need the design and implementation of coordinated health programs, which include climate-related mental health disorders that are supported by policy, as well as counseling and support programs in communities, schools, and universities where there are large populations or portions of youth. And of course, there needs to be an accompanying increase in the body of research surrounding these topics that can better help inform these strategies for dealing with climate-related mental health issues. And then from the second angle, in terms of an outlet for these frustrations that youth are feeling, I do encourage advocacy, even though it can enforce anxiety, because it's a surefire way to release pent-up frustration surrounding climate change. And if enough momentum is gained, it can result in steps in the right direction. So, for example, the work of activist groups like Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion have brought considerable attention to the climate crisis in the last 3 years, and is resulting in governments paying attention. And the Youth for Climate Summit that I mentioned earlier is one example of this, where the governments of Italy and the UK, for the first time, brought youth from every country in the world together to discuss climate change and to let their demands and their concerns be heard. So this is the kind of the value that we need to be seeing from leaders and from decision makers. But it also helps, speaking from the perspective of a climate activist, it also really helped me to see that there's so many people, so many young persons from so many different backgrounds and cultures experiencing similar feelings, although they have these differences, because it means that it is a real problem that is being experienced around the world. So I do promote activism, but I would like to advocate for youth to speak up about climate anxiety and the climate-related mental health disorders that they are feeling, and to bring these issues to light. They should incorporate climate-related mental health concerns in advocacy activities and encourage their peers to speak up. It's not a taboo topic. It is something that many people are feeling. And once you speak up, you realize that this is the case, and this can help get this topic the attention that it deserves, of course. And then finally, the most effective solution is actually just for leaders and decision makers to take the steps needed to address the climate crisis before it's too late. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to questions later on.
Thank you very much, Akil. Brilliant. Brilliant, all of you. But now you can see why I said that this young generation is filling our hearts with hope. It's energy, the energy and the quality of their inquiring and the critical thinking that they are expressing, as we can hear in the words of Akil, are just amazing. And I'm very glad that you could come and you could share, and people can see what I am talking about, having very important in young leaders coming up, because this is what I see in people like you, Akil. Thank you very much. And with these energy levels, we are going to go to Dr. Jason in Jamaica to speak a little bit from the National Society of the Red Cross perspective, how they are seeing the impact of mental health in climate change, which is impacting the region greatly. Dr. Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Esther, and to the other panel members. I would say good night, good morning, good afternoon, good day, whatever time of the day it is in your locality. Happy that you're joining at this point in time. I will be brief in my remarks, and just to say I appreciate the insights provided by all panel members who have gone ahead, and certainly piggybacking even on the last speaker, highlighting the varied increase in natural disasters in terms of rainfall, etc., and what comes with that. Invariably, as Professor Weller said at time, it's not so much a therapy individual need during these moments when we see the changes occurring around us, and in many instances, seemingly intangible they are, but have under, I wouldn't say like a snake under the carpet, kind of a stinging, lasting effect, because that's the reality. And so looking at the experience from a local standpoint, and by the way, October is Jamaica's Red Cross month, and they're doing a number of initiatives. Just want to throw that out there. So support the Jamaica Red Cross come what may as we observe Red Cross month here locally. But looking at the experiences of natural disaster and how it affects us here in Jamaica and predominantly the region, the effect of climate change on mental health. What I'll say is with increase, in fact, let me just put this forward, the kind of thesis statement that is going to guide my discussions with you, that mental health consequences of events linked to a changing global climate involves what? Mild stress and distress. It puts people at high risk coping behaviors, such as alcohol use and occasional mental health disorders concerns, such as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. And so those are some of the issues that are present, ever present to be encountered because of what, again, linked changes to global climate. And so we want to see that. Other principles of impact. Climate change is, projected to increase the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. We have seen increased rainfall here on the island, and even from a kind of personal standpoint, I have seen in a matter of 7 weeks, the downpour in terms of rain in my home community has been just tremendous and has caused little springs to be springing up here and there in the neighborhood, in the community where I live. Mini floods, if we want to put it that way. Not necessarily floods that will cause any rescue and search, but floods that have the community members say, whoa, what is happening? I haven't seen rain like this. Rain, almost water coming into my home. And one of the concerns is when the rain, many times it doesn't rain only in the day, we can appreciate. So when you have rainfall at nights, the individual is not being able to sleep. And we're not talking about a tropical storm coming our way or a pending hurricane. If we have seen over repeated rainfalls, reasonable, relative, common rainfall, but the increase in the volume of water on the ground has caused flooding, minor flooding. You have to now be taking detours. A regular route that you would travel from point A to point B cannot be traveled with a sense of certainty because of the impact of the rainfall. All of this, again, attached to climate change. So from the community level, what we're seeing is that apprehension, that fear factor, that stress factor that is lingering, that anxiety factor that is lingering. We can appreciate that we do have in the case of hurricane or reasonable rainfall, we have a hurricane season, yes. And so approaching this time of year, there's going to be increased apprehension, increased anxiety. But climate change has kind of not just have it between 2 to 3 months. I know in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, from June to November, but no, it's actually a 24-month, 12-month cycle in terms of that living reasonable on the edge. So you'll find even within the communities, based on your locality, there are individuals who live in areas that were reasonably safe, you would say, but now due to increased rainfall, land slippage is a factor that they have to encounter. So again, whilst rain will come or has come, you find that they have to find alternate routes to their home, to their livelihood, to engage in their livelihood. The impact of natural disasters on people's livelihood is like one after the other. And again, when we talk about, I don't want us to limit it. I know in certain locality, you have your unique disasters. We know our friends in St. Vincent, they would have had their natural disaster being a volcano of recent time and what that meant for them. But we have areas where there's fire, where there are storms, water, earthquake. Again, with our brothers and sisters in Haiti, they would have had their own fear of challenges. But bring it closer home as I speak to our reality here on the ground in Jamaica. Whilst our predominant natural disaster is based on rainfall, we are seeing that increased fear factor. People are losing properties, they're losing their livelihood, crops, and this has caused considerable disruption to that community camaraderie. One of the, would say, the positive spin-offs, if anything, is that the community then gets a sense of cohesion and there is a pulling together during the events that are caused by natural disasters, again, all be linked to climate change. When we talk about erosion of our beach-lined shores and that constant living in fear, we are seeing how the times are moving so quickly. As a child, you used to go to the beach and you used to can estimate that between when the beach approaching, the erosion of the shoreline, that has certainly increased greatly. And so people, again, can't utilize these recreational areas because the depth of the water gets quickly in terms of can't even have a fair swim or a safe swim because you might not have that swimming capability. So the impact of climate change at the community level is causing people not to be able to go out and enjoy themselves as fully as they can. So we really want to be cognizant of that. We really want to be cognizant of that. As I said, increased rainfall in short intervals resulting in landslides, road blockage, flooding. We have an increase in anxiety issues, yes, panic issues, post-traumatic stress issues. And so at the community level, one must be conscious of these. And invariably, again, the increased impact of disasters outside of anticipated season prolong the worry and stress factor that at minimal will cause distress on our people. And so many times they might not present with any by and large psychopathological issue that requires long-term or short-term therapy. But there's that notion of fear, the slightest blackening of the cloud. What does that mean for me as an individual? So we see that there is absolutely great need for psychological first aid and looking at the mental health kind of approach from the community level. Even here on the island, our own Ministry of Health and Wellness certainly pushing mental health outreach from a community level, where we have ranges, we have persons looking out for your neighbor. You're sleeping well, you're eating well, the rain came last night, how you approach it, how you manage it. These kind of one-on-one approach, checking in with individuals, goes a far way to reassure mental health, and reassure people's resilience to bounce back prior to a natural disaster and a disaster of whatever severity, because that's the approach that we are even taking. And as a mental health practitioner, we are very conscious that there's the spectrum approach in how we relate to individuals. So what is of mild severity to you might be of another type of severity to another individual. So we want to be conscious of that as we seek to assist and offer help by and large. But in summary, what I want to share is that there is great apprehension on the local level, on the grassroots kind of reach, because of the impact of climate change. We have gotten more rainfall than usual times. We're getting more rainfall outside of the seasons, outside of projected impact of a system on the island. And that we have to be conscious of. I know the Red Cross continues to engage in psychological first aid training, continues to partner with the Ministry of Health and Wellness, continues to do home visits based on other areas of its outreach. And in doing this, we are seeking to advance psychological first aid as one of those tools that we can check in with community members as to how are they doing and provide that support. Over to you, Lady Esther.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Always very interesting to hear your experience in Jamaica, and the way the National Society also is using for psychological aid, which is a very important tool to support the community, which is greatly affected, as you mentioned, by not just the hurricane season, but also by the change in climate lately. So thank you very much. And on that note, we are going to Jerwayne, who is talking from St. Vincent and Grenadine, who were just affected by a major natural disaster. And I want to hear from you, what were the experiences that you hear from people regarding mental health?
Yes, hi, good day to everyone. Really glad to be here, and I really want to thank the panelists who went before me because they kind of set the platform for everything. Dr. Jason basically summarized a lot of what is happening here in St. Vincent. What I would say in the case of starting off this whole discussion is that change is something that persons or people don't like, and just the everyday stress is a lot. And we're talking about climate change, which with it bring changes, and with these changes bring more stress. And that's some of the things that I could tell you straight off the bat is happening here. You just mentioned the whole volcanic eruption, and I'll speak a little bit on that in a bit. But just to go back a little on some of what was spoken of before, the whole mention of documentation and that whole research in this area, and the limited knowledge or information that is there, to actually impact on helping is something that's critical. And I think here in St. Vincent, being coming from the National Society here, because I'm the psychosocial support focal point for our National Society here. And what I've realized as we're trying to develop, this team to support in this area of mental health, that we have realized that the basic structure, as mentioned by Dr. Peters, is what is needed. And coming out of the volcanic eruption, we would have had, the Prime Minister saying that all entities need to come together and provide that psychosocial support. Because what was mentioned by Dr. Peters is true. You had a lot of organizations on the ground providing what we say PSS, but they were doing their own thing in their own little corner. So at one point, you just have to say, hold on, everyone come together and let's plan this thing properly. So now there is actually a structure that is being worked on here to actually develop that sort of support. It's still a lot of work, it's still a lot of tweaking that is needed, but it's a start. And I think that is a plus that, we would have seen coming out of this whole volcanic eruption. All right. So when you talk about anxiety, I heard Akil mention it about the whole anxiety. I mean, when you look at persons are already having pre-existing conditions, people are already fearful, scared of different things. And then you have things that are happening on a regular basis or even more. You say extreme. This is something that, we have seen over the years. So here in St. Vincent, I will go back a bit on what has happened in the past. So in 2010, I will go from then, because Hurricane Thomas was one of the hurricanes that hit us. And just mind you, we always say we're land of the best. I know Jamaica does want to take it sometime, but here in St. Vincent, we always say St. Vincent and the Grenadines is land of the blessed. And we would have noticed over time that you would have hurricanes passing. They would either go north, they would go south, or they might pass even straight over us, like Hurricane Matthew. Pass right over us, no impact. But yet, you heard the devastation in different places. And to me, persons started to develop a sense of complacency. So it's like you heard alerts, you heard prepare for this, and persons start not preparing, not worrying. Oh, we're going to pass over, nothing's going to happen to us. That's all the complacency. Another behavior I saw coming out also was that of uncertainty. Because after 2010, you had a series of events starting to happen. You had the 2013 floods in December, that Christmas Eve event. That was something that I think is on everybody, somewhere once December is coming up, I think it's something that persons would just start thinking of. Sometimes when we're in the field, you will hear persons mention, since that 2013 flood, they are unable to sleep. And we heard, Dr. Jason talking about that. They're unable to sleep because once rain starts pouring, they start to feel anxious, they start to feel fearful. They just feel like something's going to happen. Because during that event, you would see that something happened here that didn't happen within, a certain time frame. It never happened before in those areas. So you had 3 areas where there was intense flooding, and we lost, lives during that time. So the impact of that event, has left a mark on many persons within communities. And then since then, and this is just from a trough system. So it's not even to say it's a hurricane category 1, 2, 3. It was just a trough system. And since then, we have had depressions, just disturbances. With any little rain, persons start worrying. First time days when we're going to school, rain come, children going to school still. You walk in the rain, you get wet down, this teacher might send you back home, whatever the case will be. But that was fun. But no, once rain starts pouring, you start hearing messages coming into Nemo. No school today, this, so the behavior towards the whole, pattern has changed. So people start being a bit more conscious of the weather, checking with Met Office, doing all these different things. So you're seeing behavior patterns starting to change from since these events have started to, basically intensify. So what you have been seeing over time now is that once rain comes, these same, especially the communities that were impacted, you will find that the National Disaster Office will be checking these communities and seeing what is happening in the communities and so forth. So you realize that, persons are on edge anytime there's heavy rain. And this has been happening now from since that time. You will just see rain. But then you're sometimes seeing, a whole intense month of extreme heat. So, persons are already frustrated, people are already tired, working hard, and then you have this heat for a whole month. So that stress is developed, is built upon, and so forth. So besides the complacency, you have uncertainty, and then you also have this whole dependency. Because now over time, persons have been impacted by these various events. They have now become dependent on the government to provide support. Things that you would have found before where some persons would have automatically in a community come together and support each other, and now kind of sitting back and developing that whole attitude of, the government would fix this or the government would do their part. So the whole mindset, is kind of changing also for some. I'm not saying it's majority, but I'm just saying, you go to various communities, different points, and you talk to different persons, and the feedback you're getting, you're realizing, that culture that's being developed and the kind of environment, and something that we also have to be aware of. But then there's also what we call the hopeful set of persons, because St. Vincent is seen as a Christian country. Most persons here are religious, and therefore a lot of persons, their faith has been even strengthened based on the impacts, because some persons believe that these are the last days and these things would happen and better days are coming, so they hold on to that. So you have a variety of different feelings and things that are happening here. But at the end of the day, we see the effects that climate change is having on various sets of persons, and from the senior to the young, it's having an effect right across the board. I don't think anyone is left out, as per se. And just to talk a bit about the fear factor, and I think that's really the main thing, is that the whole anticipation, the whole not knowing or what to expect is what have a lot of persons on edge, and would continue to have a lot of persons on edge. Because here in St. Vincent, as most persons know, we went through that whole volcanic eruption. I mean, that started from December, right up to the point of the eruption in April. And then a lot of persons being dispersed, not being able to, do as they would have done, when they're at home. They're not able to cook for themselves in some cases, and, just not having that whole independent feeling was already an issue. And then this leading right down into the hurricane season, where we are already preparing for that possible rain. And then we were even touched a bit just when person started to go back home, when we had that heavy rain and the winds, where some of the persons who were already affected lost their homes. So it was like a multifaceted development of persons being affected over time. So it's like you already have the normal stress, then you start having these effects that you're trying to, rebuild from and try to get over. And then now you're going to another situation where you realize, oh, I don't know what's going to happen next. And persons were kind of fearful in going back home, because what you would have found is that the persons who are affected by the volcanic eruption are most likely the same set of persons who would be affected by heavy rainfall or a hurricane or a storm passing through. So these kinds of disturbances would really and truly impact persons mentally. The thing about it is that we don't have any documentation to say that you would have seen over time a rise in persons who have shown. What you may see though is at the shelters or at various places, persons are drinking excessively. They just not doing things that they normally do at times. And that's some of the key things that we would see. And, just providing that basic psychosocial support that was mentioned is really key. And as Dr. Peter said, I think it's something we really and truly need to tie down, is understanding how to provide that psychosocial support at that level of care, where you're just providing that whole the necessities, the food, the shelter, communication, whatever the case may be, before you start thinking about counseling or psychotherapy or whatever the case may be. I think that platform needs to be set, and that is what I think we're working on now, and hopefully we'll get it right as we try to have an impact on how persons are affected here. Because as I would have noted earlier, is that you hear when you speak to persons who are affected again, how they felt from since they had an event or a traumatic event before. And basically they would have, coped with it the best way they knew. And we realized through that a lot of persons don't have the proper coping skills, and this would just, not help their situation in any way. All right. So I'm really not going to go over a lot of what was said before, because as I said, what Dr. Jason said would have, mentioned a lot of what is going on here. It's a mirror of exactly what's happening here, because we are affected by, similar hazards, and persons here basically cope the same way. For instance, I could say in 2010, 2011, when we had that whole, we call it Georgetown mashup, which is one of those towns in St. Vincent on the rural side, you would have had a whole town being mashed up by heavy flooding and a lot of trees, and so coming down and destroying a certain area in that area. And what would have happened the next year was that an artist would have made a song about it, and that's a song that's played throughout Georgetown mashup, and people laugh and thing, but that event, still impacts persons up to this day. So at the end of the day, persons have different ways of coping. We try to talk about resilience, bouncing back, but as noted, a lot of persons are affected by the whole impacts of climate change, and it's important for us to have something in place to really and truly work with them, and help them to build that coping skill, help them to be able to understand how to deal with the stresses that come, or the impacts from these different events, and so forth. All right, so that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Jeraine. Thank you for giving us this amazing understanding of how the community feels about the changes, and how the changes are bringing difference in behavior, even in a community that is already experiencing yearly the natural disasters. And I believe what you said at the very end is exactly the dilemma that, in the complexity that poses a challenge for people like Dr. Judah to research, is the positive growth that happens and the cope mechanisms, and also on the other hand, people that are experiencing it in a completely different way, even though they are in the same environment. So this is the complexity and the amazing things that comes up in his search. And with all that have been said, I want to give the mic to Dawn to just give her take on the subject, and also give a little bit of a summary of what we have discussed, and questions for the participants as well. And you that are listening to us and seeing us live, also please comment, send your question, and the participants will be gladly to reply to you. Dawn, the mic's yours.
Okay, thank you everyone. I'm hoping everyone can hear me all right. I started to try to prepare for this session by speaking to what I understand of climate and mental health. And I immediately started to think of SAD, which is seasonal affective disorder, because this is what I've heard of going back many years. And even perhaps having lived in the global north, or lived in North American countries, or even in Europe, it's something that I've heard of a lot and even may have experienced. But listening to and noting, however, that this is not something that necessarily applies to the Caribbean region also, although I thought maybe I would try and link the two. However, listening to these discussions just makes you realize how much broader, larger this challenge is. And I'm going to try really, because there was so much interesting information provided by everyone in terms of trying to pull the key points or the many key points together in terms of this whole discussion. So we started off by hearing, for example, that children born in today's world are likely to experience climate change challenges for their entire life. That is mind-blowing in itself, but this was something that first struck me in terms of one of these challenges, or the challenge in the world today. There was a discussion in terms of how this influences our communities, and then there's increases in crime and violence. So this issue of climate change is so widespread and far-reaching. Also speaking to how this is linked to increases in migration due to displacement after events. This is something that we are seeing a lot in the Caribbean region at the moment. Migration as a result, for example, to what is taking place in Venezuela. But then given climate change and the amount of rain, it's also impacting persons who are now having to find places to live, having moved. Speaking also to the fact that a lot of research has been done, but it's not necessarily being done in the communities or in the areas that are really, really being impacted by climate change, speaking to small island developing states. And then even Joanne was speaking to the kind of impact that is then having in communities in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. High levels of mental health issues being noticed as a result of climate change, using words like PTSD. We've heard of these things, but not really relating it to climate. You know, we think of PTSD in a war situation, but now we're actually speaking about it within the context of Caribbean islands related to climate change. So again, increases in PTSD, looking at increases in suicides in our region relating to this issue, and then that obviously has increased burden on our healthcare systems, which in itself are already challenged in the first place. And this is even before COVID. Again, small island developing states, given our economies, our healthcare systems don't have the space to put these systems, in place. But then if we're having increases in these challenges, it places increasing burdens on our systems. Jura mentioned ecological grief, which was interesting, speaking to something called soul nostalgia and the feeling of homesickness as a result of climate change. Vicarious anticipated exposure was also quite interesting, where there's this anxiety based on anticipated challenges that are looking to come. And this is something you think of children looking at the news today. They are supposed to be enjoying their lives, but they're looking at the news and understanding what is going on, and then getting anxious as a result of what is likely to come. So again, that is something that is obviously causing an impact. We then went on to Peter, who spoke of CANPA and their coordinating role and what they would like to do in terms of facilitating coordination in the region, in terms of psychology services and the need for this. Noticing also that, or highlighting that there isn't a common framework in the region, and this is the importance of having to develop that. And again, this relates to something Joanne was saying in terms of the number of organizations that landed on the island, but there was no coordination framework. And again, this speaks to the linkages between what our panelists have been speaking to. Peter also spoke to ensuring that there's cultural appropriateness in the kind of PSS services that are provided, and also speaking to the importance of religion, which also was mentioned by Joanne in terms of considering this as an issue when you're trying to respond to these issues. There's also the importance of the provision of not necessarily psychological services, but psychological first aid. So encouraging community members, building their capacities so that they can respond in a disaster or climate change situation, because ultimately sometimes this is just what is needed at that time. So the importance of, again, building capacities, and this is something that Red Cross volunteers are doing, and they can definitely provide to ensure that we are assisting our communities having been impacted by climate issues. Self-care campaigns, again, faith-based, very important. And then we spoke also of the importance of sharing data so that we are best understanding what is taking place and making sure that data is current and relevant. And that obviously informs the information and or the services that we are likely to be able to provide. Akil gave a youth focus, really impressive to see that he was able to attend the UN conference recently, and just speaking to the whole idea of youth activism. He mentioned, some climate events that have taken place in different parts of the world fairly recently, like 3 years worth of rain falling in a matter of hours in one small country. And could you imagine the kind of impact that would have on communities? And this obviously is a climate issue. But then there's also what he mentioned in terms of this being like a positive feedback loop. Was a point he made in terms of young persons now becoming more aware of climate issues, but it is also manifesting in mental health issues within this group. So this awareness is good, but then it is increasing mental health issues. It's also good that it has led to youth climate action, but then what also resonates is inaction by your leaders, which then again causes more anxieties and mental health challenges in young persons. So again, Akil also spoke to a paucity of research and lack of data, not only on climate and mental health issues, but there is also a lack of data that is particularly targeted at youth communities. We then went on to the discussions from our two colleagues, Jason and Joanne, who are giving more of a Red Cross or community experience, speaking to understanding that the hurricane season exists, but also knowing that it doesn't seem as if there's a hurricane season anymore because there are persistent small events that are causing small challenges, but lots and not challenges, causing a whole lot of damage, and the impact this is then having on the levels of panic, stress, and anxiety in our communities. And this again causing more landslides, and persons having experienced this so often over the years. Joanne mentioned this starting back in 2010, but now you have communities who are constantly anxious when the clouds start to change color, because of what has happened to them previously and what is consistently happening more regularly in our communities. Jason also spoke to this whole idea of beach erosion. This has to do, rising sea levels. This now means, even while that we are locked down as a result of COVID, but communities now can't even go onto the beach anymore because these places just don't exist. And that also, there's no release then, there's no opportunity for children or young persons or persons in general to go and relieve some of the stress because some of these areas just don't exist anymore. I hope I have kind of gathered the information that persons have been provided. I suppose I'm forgetting now here, or I've noticed now here in my notes that something positive has come out of the event in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in terms of their national emergency management organization now consistently checking on communities more. So that I think is a good thing, but then it also goes back to the point that there is a whole challenge, in terms of the compounding emergencies that are taking place. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they had, same as I've just described, in terms of many small climate events, but then they had the volcano, and that also impacted climate events in terms of lots of rain and then flooding and then more challenges and more young persons are stressed. The economies are being impacted. Food and nutrition is being impacted. So families, in essence, are also being challenged by this whole issue of climate change. So that, in a very quick nutshell, is hopefully a good overview of what was discussed. And now I'm hoping that we have some questions, or our panelists will, I'm sure, be happy to answer questions. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. You did a brilliant job. you summarized very well. And now I want to propose the panelists if they have questions for each other after hearing you, you all among yourselves. So I will start from the beginning with Dr. Jura. Dr. Jura, do you have any questions for any of the panelists?
Thanks, Esther. I suppose just listening, and I think we all agree about sort of the need for more data, for different kinds of data, for engagement across expertise, with youth experts, with experts doing work on the ground. So I just wanted to ask my fellow panelists how you think we can best actually do this. What sorts of things do you think would be helpful? How can we more easily share data? How do we make the research process more accessible, or skip it if it's if it's completely inaccessible, in order to provide information that people need? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. And Akil, I'm curious to hear from you in particular as to how you think we can engage best with youth experts to ensure that we're working together on teams and building this data and evidence together based on these lived experiences.
Thanks, Drew. That's a good question. I think there's already a means by which to do that, and I spoke about it earlier during my presentation. And I think it's the amount of young persons that are currently taking action, are currently working within NGOs and other community groups to get climate action done. I think there are networks that exist that would be very happy to participate in studies, about the effects of these different things on young persons. And I'm pretty sure that was one of the ways that the study that I mentioned would have probably collected information. I mean, it seems like a really good way. And based on my peers, they're always so willing to talk about these things. They're willing to talk about what they're feeling, but they just feel like no one's listening. So I think the academic community and anyone else who's conducting research or funding research can really tap into these existing resources to mobilize youth opinions on these topics, and maybe help develop strategies based off of that.
Thank you, Akil. Dr. Jura, this answer your questions?
I think it's a great start, Esther, and would love to just leave it to the rest of the panel.
And Akil, Dr. Peter, you want to share?
I was just going to add to what Akil said, and implicit in what he's saying is you have to go to the people to find out what they need and what they want to know. And sometimes there's a disconnect between what we study and what the people in the field want to find out. Partly because what the people in the field want to find out, we know already, we just haven't shared with them. That's one reason. So it's the dissemination and the sharing. But also because, I said earlier, psychological first aid was important. I was not only talking about psychological first aid in the examples, like, for example, what Jerwayne said, on the ground, in the moment. Psychological first aid is required right up the socioecological level at all levels of management. People are needing to find out how to cope. It doesn't have to be water flooding their house. It may be feeling overwhelmed with the volume of projects they have to manage because of the disaster, the crisis, or the climate change. And that kind of help needs to be informed by research also. What are the systems that need to be put in place? But what are the needs that people have? So it keeps going back to, if you want to understand somebody, you have to go where they are, understand what's going on with them, and then decide what we're going to do. So to answer, dissemination is critical. Sometimes we have the information, but we're so busy studying the next thing that we haven't shared what we know already with who need it. And then the other is really finding out what people feel they need. And here's the crux of the matter. Sometimes we, experts and researchers, know what is needed. Those on the ground, because they don't have our expertise, have a different perception. And we have to meet them there and perhaps sometimes hear what they know better than us, but sometimes help them to understand what we know better than them. And we can't do it with a big stick. I'm coming to tell you, Jerwayne, what you must do in St. Vincent because I'm a clinical psychologist. Maybe I know something Jerwayne doesn't know, but I can be sure Jerwayne knows something I don't know. And we need to have a conversation. Um, and the spaces for those conversations, I think, are limited. Uh, they're very task oriented and problem solving, focused, and not, hey, let's talk, let's reason, let's share. Here's what I've been through, here's what you've been through, here's what my grandparents went through back in the day, and here's what the data is showing. What do we make of that? We need more of those kinds of spaces. It's not easy, but I think that it's critical.
I want to agree a lot with what Dr. Wale is saying because on the ground, with the various disasters, um, comes aid, and with aid comes projects and studies and this, and persons sometimes become overwhelmed with all this, research, and then sometimes it seems like if nothing is happening after, all this is done. So that whole dissemination of information sometimes is lacking in the sense of, getting back to the communities, making sure that what was done before or the information that was requested actually gets back to the persons who assisted. That there must be a handshake. It cannot be separated. That whole community approach, making sure you walk the whole way through is important. All right.
Thank you, Jerwayne. And do you have any question for any of the participants as well, Jerwayne?
Not really a question. I just would like to tap in a lot to, the experts here, especially Dr. Weller, to see how we can, here help to develop that, that system. Because you spoke well on it. And I really think that's something that really can, appreciate and work from. And, all the panelists here we can work from and get some kind of support. So from the research documentation to, the support for youth, I think, we can gain a lot from each person here, and even from Jason, who usually face the same issues that we have, and they have a better a system that has been there for a while in Jamaica. I can learn from that also. So it's not really a question, but just to see how I could reach out and get that continued support as we continue to develop here.
Well, happy to provide support. I'll just leave it at that. We'll keep in touch.
Great. Great. Thank you, everyone. We have a comment on our chat. Someone is asking, how can they be mental health facilitator on the Red Cross branch? So on that, I leave for Jerwayne, who is representative of our national society. How can a person reach out and be a mental health facilitator in the national society?
Okay, so well, in our case, it's usually through volunteering. In Red Cross, there are various sectors that you can volunteer for. I mean, some persons have various backgrounds, various type of skill sets that they would want to support with. So it's just a matter of reaching out to whichever organization in your local, and sign up, tell them your skill set and what you're interested in, and they would point you in the right direction. For us here in St. Vincent, it's just going to the headquarters, going through some basic steps of registering, and then there must be some investigation because some of these areas are sensitive, and you don't really want to put certain persons in places that are not safe, because when you talk about that whole childcare and protection and all these different things, it's important to make sure the volunteers have a background check and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's as simple as going to the National Society and applying to be a volunteer, and then later on you will be able to access that training, that skill set that is required to join whichever area. So in the case of mental health support, we have psychosocial support teams. It might be different in different areas or locales. You just need to go and inquire at the organization in your area.
Thank you very much, Jerwin. And we are coming to an end for this panel. I want to thank you all, and I want to give you the mic for final remarks, starting from Akil, that I know you have to leave. And I'm very thankful for each one of you for giving your time and your words and sharing your brain and experiences with us today. And I will give you the mic, Akil, to give final remarks, and then we will pass along to all of you.
Thank you, Esther. Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Esther said. Is this kind of discussion, this kind of forum, is really useful, and also to enforce what Dr. Weller said, where bottom-up approaches are really important, to factor in the needs of people on the ground who will be affected by the outcomes of the research. This is really important in developing strategies that are actually needed, that address the problems that are actually need addressing. So yeah, really important. I'm glad that this is happening. I think that speaking for a lot of young people, this is really useful, to know that there is work being done on climate change and mental health that is really not talked about in our domain as youth climate activists. And so, yeah, it does give me a lot of hope as well. So thank you for having me, and it's been a pleasure chatting with all of you and learning from you.
Thank you, Akil. And we pass now to Dr. Peter to give final remarks. You are on mute, Dr. Peter.
Yes. See, I told you I'm not doing well with this juggling business. It's all part of creeping climate change and COVID. Um, the Caribbean Alliance of National Psychological Associations is having a conference in November. CCRP, if you check it out, CRCP 2020. If you Google it, you'll find out about the conference and how to register. There's going to be a pre-conference forum in which we speak specifically about disaster, mental health issues, and capacity building. So I would encourage you all to follow up on that and hopefully participate. I think this is one way in which we can not only build capacity, but begin to meet each other and have these conversations about the way forward. This is a very difficult time. We talk about it kind of in abstract, but each of us, well, I won't speak for you all, but I think many of us are experiencing levels of stress and distraction that are making us less competent at what we do in one way or another. It's a human condition. And I think we have to factor that into any programs we design, that people are not going to be able to do everything they used to be able to do. And therefore, we have to manage our expectations. And the expectations we have to manage most are those we have of ourselves. So please take care of yourselves, all of those listening and the panel. Be kind, be gentle. And if you make a mistake, like I did with the time, forgive yourself and try to do better next time. Wishing you all the best.
Thank you, Dr. Peter. Thank you. We will pass now to Jerwin to give final remarks.
Right. So, simply put, what I would say is that psychosocial support is something that can be provided by everyone. You don't have to be a skilled a psychologist or a counselor or anything. You just need to understand the skills that are needed, to look, listen, and link. And once you understand those basic skills, you can help someone who may be stressing, someone who may be overwhelmed, and actually help to prevent them from actually, becoming critically ill. All right. So that's something that's important for us to highlight. And once that is done, we can really and truly help persons who are going through stressful times. That's it from me.
Thank you, Jerwin. Very important final remarks. Thank you. And Dr. Jura, that's with you. And I saw a pet. I'm sorry, I have to comment. I saw a pet. If the pet has final remarks, also please.
I think his final remarks would be something about his empty food plate, Sarah. But thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this wonderful panel. It was such a pleasure meeting fellow panelists and you, Esther and Don. I suppose just to close, I think really to echo what others have said. What Akil said about and Dr. Weller about the importance of listening first and understanding needs and designing and building programs with communities to respond to needs that actually matter to them. That's more important than ever, and it's always been critical. And then, commenting on what Jerwayne has talked about in terms of really providing holistic supports and the kinds of supports that are actually needed in the context of both acute and chronic challenges. So ensuring that we're not just thinking about sort of traditional therapeutic approaches, but really what people need in the immediate aftermath of an event or in general, just to meet their basic needs to care for their families. And then to promote mental health and well-being from there, I think is critical. So looking forward to continuing this conversation and future events and working with you all in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Jura, and I hope we have lots of events to cooperate and collaborate with. Really enjoy every and each one of you. And Dawn, I will give you the mic to give your final remarks as well. And just to comment, even though we had some longer periods of time for participants or stumbling with time, we are exactly on time for the event. So thank you all, everyone. We did very well. Dawn, it's with you.
Basically just to congratulate everyone really for what they said. Everything is so relevant, and I suppose my last point is our responsibility now to kind of help the communities that we work with to connect the dots, because sometimes you don't immediately think that there's a link between climate and how we are feeling. And even communities sometimes don't even realize the services that are available out there, so that they don't know how to access them. So I suppose maybe this is something that going forward that we can try to focus on to help people to connect the dots, and also to make them aware of what's available from the Red Cross and other agencies, or even that services are out there to help persons to cope better when the clouds start to get dark, because that is a reality. The clouds are getting darker so much more often, so that would speak to the extent of the anxiety and stress that exists in our communities. So on that note, I will put a pause, and I thank you. Congratulations again to everyone. Very interesting topic.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone that was tuned and was listening to us. And thank you especially to Maria, has always giving support to our events and was managing the behind the scenes. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy your weekend that is just starting in a few hours.